Welcome to Heresy, the Horus Heresy talk show. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to build a list for Mechanicum in Horus Heresy, Age of Darkness. We're going to be going over all of the Mechanicum Strengths and Weaknesses, the most powerful units, the Roleplayer Units and the Situational Units, which high Techno-Arcana that you should choose, some general list building advice for Mechanicum, and also some sample army lists as well from my personal armies that I'm building for this faction. And then finally, we'll round all that up with a nice summary of what we've discussed. But before we do all that, if you enjoy the content, please do leave me a like and a subscribe. And if you've got any comments, please leave them on YouTube down below. And finally, please join us on the Heresy Discord. There's a link to that in the video description too. And now, on with the show. Firstly, just a little bit about this video. So this video focuses on gameplay more than theme. And one thing Mechanicum is certainly very good at is having very strongly themed armies. So if you've got cool ideas or you want to use certain units, don't take any of this advice as gospel. Use this advice blended with your own ideas to make something that's cool and effective on the tabletop as well. Don't throw out any cool ideas you've got just because I'm going to tell you that certain units aren't very good. For this video, we're also focusing on Tagmata, so we're not factoring in Skitarii or Titans and the Night Houses. There are things you can do with them in Mechanicum armies, but we're just focusing on Tagmata for this. For specific unit discussion, check out my other videos that I've got. There's a 6-part review of the Mechanicum book where we go into all the units in a bit more detail as well. And finally, just to set the scene, Liber Mechanicum is a weaker book than Liber Space Marine books. It just is. It's a little bit less well balanced. They're a bit more maybe nerfed from their Horus Heresy 1 version. You just need to accept this and move on with enjoying the faction. You know, if you want to have good games with this, you want to try to make armies, you just got to accept that they're not quite as good as Marines and find ways to play them and be successful with them. But if you really focus on things like how good Dreadnoughts are or how good Marine units are, you're not going to enjoy playing your army. So just, accept it and move on. Let's have a look at what Mechanicum's strengths are first so we know what we're working with. Well, shooting is obviously their big strength. They are a shooting-based faction. They've got lots of powerful weapons and interesting weapons as well. They're very good at AP2 and 3 blast templates. They're really good at killing Space Marines en masse, and that's something that Space Marines aren't good at doing to each other necessarily with lots of units, and Mechanicum have got an abundance of things that can just kill lots of things, with a 3+ save particularly, but also with a 2+ save as well. Mechanicum are also really good at debuffs, so blind and concussive, they got this on loads of weapons that you can use and you're going to use. They've also got access to pinning as well, and compared to Space Marines, there's debuffs all over the place in this army, and although they don't have the greatest chance individually of going off, blind in particular goes off 1 in 3 times on most units, and the debuff is so big that, when you've got a bit of blind spammed around, you're hitting the opponent with it. It's really good. You've also got easy access to shock pulse on a really good unit, which can take a vehicle out the game too. So really good at debuffs, Mechanicum. They're also tougher than average being Space Marines. So most of the units are toughness 5 or more. They've generally got a higher than average toughness to wounds ratio, for their cost, toughness and wounds ratio for their cost. And they've got a lot of 5+ invulnerable saves in the army as well that, Space Marine armies don't necessarily have. You can also make armies of exclusively high toughness units. If you use lots of Castellax, you got lots of toughness 6, which means that lots of enemy weapons will just be really ineffective. So they're not necessarily super tough always for their points, because sometimes they've got slightly lesser save than, equivalent Space Marine units and so on, but they also bring some feel no pain on some units too. In general, they're slightly tougher than average as an army. They've also got really excellent line options, so Ad Secularis are really cheap. You've got Tech Priest Auxilia that are a buffing unit whilst also being line, and Thalax are just powerful. They move very fast, they've got efficient guns, they're quite tough for their points as well. Really good line options for Mechanicum. They're more mobile than average, because most of the heavy weapons can move and shoot, so most of their things are on robots, which can move around while shooting their guns, Myrmidons, which can move and shoot their guns as well. And even their shooting units have got decent melee weapons, so lots of shooting units, in Space Marines, for example, are dead in the water once they're locked in combat. They've got no chance, whereas most Mechanicum have at least got some weapons. You often find units with shock charges, which are AP3, and, a decent base strength as well. So they're not awful in combat, even though the weapon skills are a bit lacking. They're better in combat than your average shooting unit, so at least they've got something to fall back on. And lastly, I'm going to call out specifically Graviton weapons. Graviton weapons are really good in Horus Heresy, and Mechanicum have got a really easy access to bringing a lot of it in their army, and that's good for killing dreadnoughts and vehicles. It's also good just for chucking a ton of, dangerous terrain onto the floor against infantry armies as well, and that's definitely a strength. Weaknesses that we have to be aware of, though. So, cost inefficient as a whole, Mechanicum units are a bit expensive for what they do, and that's one of the big factors that contributes to them being a bit worse than Space Marines overall. They're just a little bit expensive across the whole army. They've got a lack of reactions as well. Now, this is a real big drawback, and I think this is maybe a little bit too much. I don't think the army really needed this as a huge drawback, but you can mitigate it by using your Cybernetica, but that does make expensive units already more expensive by mitigating this, so it's certainly something that you've got to be aware of. They got a lack of elite melee. Sometimes you do just need to, charge into an objective or fight an enemy unit or something like that, or defend against an enemy elite melee unit, and there isn't really anything capable of doing that in Mechanicum at all. They don't have great combat stats, and they don't really have the weapons either, so that's a bit of a problem. Instant death's also a problem for Mechanicum as well. Now, although a lot of units, like robots and stuff, only take D3 wounds from it because of automatic deflectors, you do have a lot of units that are toughness 5, things like Myrmidons or some of the HQs that, are very vulnerable to instant death because it just removes that advantage of being toughness 5. They can be quite self-destructive as an army as well, so there's a lot of gets hot weapons, and particularly some of the really attractive options do have gets hot on them with a lot of shots, so you will hurt yourself with it a lot, and they penetrate the armor of the units that are firing them, so you will take the damage. You've also got lots of units with automatic deflectors, which will explode onto your own men a lot of the time, even their own units as well. So they do tend to damage themselves as an army as the game goes on, which isn't great given how cost inefficient they are to start with. They have a reliance on debuffs and synergies, and these things, in a lot of armies, in a lot of games, when you get some great synergies and debuffs, you take an already good unit, you apply some debuffs or a nice buff to your unit, and it makes your unit better. In the case of Mechanicum, these synergies actually just put the unit where maybe it should be for its cost, like granting reactions to robots. They probably didn't need to have no reactions for their cost anyway, so you're forced to use the synergies just to bring your army up to the level it probably should be at, rather than to consider this a big strength. That does mean the army is quite fun to play, though, because in order to get the army to a sort of reasonable point, you have got lots of things to do. You are also a bit vulnerable to bad luck on Cybernetica rolls, which are going to potentially pin the unit as well, do a wound to the caster, or Battlesmith rolls, which are highly variable. Normally 1 dice on a 4+ at best, which isn't great. Snipers shooting your support units, or just good enemy target priority, meaning that either you've got nothing to buff or nothing to buff with, can leave your army a little bit less than the sum of its parts. And finally, there's a limited number of genuinely great units in the army, because of the general cost inefficiency, but also because, legions are sort of balanced against each other because they've all got these kind of silly, kind of undercosted, very powerful, unique units, but they've all got some. So, it sort of balances out across the armies. Well, Mechanicum have got nothing like that. They've got no kind of silly, undercosted, slightly powerful units, which means that they're limited in the number of good stuff they've got to choose from to just their normal army list. There's a small hope here that some units that aren't very good right now get FAQ'd, some weapons get brutal, some of that kind of stuff, which might widen the pool, but, best not to hold out too much hope for that. So now we know the strengths and weaknesses, what we're trying to do and what we're trying to mitigate against, let's look at the best units in the book. So for HQ, the Archmagus and Magus Dominus are both great, both versions, Abeyant or not, both very good. In the elites category, we've got the Tech Priest Auxilia and Myrmidon Secutors, which are really good. Troops and Transports, Ad Secularis, Thalax, and the Triaros are all great units. Fast Attack Vorax is a bit of an all-star too. Heavy Support, there's plenty to choose from, so both types of Thanatars are really good. Myrmidon Destructors are really good. The Karachnos is really good, and so is the Knight Morax as well. So, there's a good chunk of units to choose from there. Maybe not as many as if you were a Space Marine player, but a good chunk to choose from. Roleplayer units. So if you're not familiar with the term, this is generally units that are good if you need them to do the specific thing they're good at, but not necessarily incredible in their own right. So we got the Voltarax in Fast Attack. It's good at being a fast, mobile Haywire unit, although you can get more Haywire shots for more efficient points in other units, but it's also the only real access to anti-air that the army's got, because it can fly around and disrupt enemy flyers, and disruption hits even if you don't roll a 6 because of the way the rule's written currently, which is at least something the Voltarax can do if you're worried about flyers. And for heavy support, the Krios Venator is pretty good as well. Now, it's quite a cost-efficient unit, this. It's got a very big pinning multi-shot las cannon, and it's very fast. It's not necessarily something that the rest of your army can't do better in the star units in terms of getting those big shots out. But, if you want to use one of these, or if you really do fancy a unit that can flank, it's certainly a unit that can do that for you. And then a few thematic or situational units that we may use depending on what we're doing. So the Castellax is in here. This is good in a Cybernetica army. They get good because they get line. Outside of that, they're a little bit questionable because they're a little bit expensive. In the fast attack category, we've got Ursarax. So if you want something that can jump around the battlefield and, push around, cause your opponent some problems, these are not bad at that, although they're not super efficient. And then both the Knight Megara and the Knight Atropos are okay at what they do. And if you want to understand why that is, you can look at the Knights review that I did as well. But they're okay and potentially usable. Now, which high Techno-Arcana you take can and will have a big effect on your army, but you may have a particular theme in mind which may dictate the choice here rather than, trying to build an army around it. So up to you how you do that. Cybernetica, if you want to do a Castellax army, if you want to do a Cybernetica army, you're taking Cybernetica. It's a very heavily themed thing to do. So that's a kind of obvious choice. Reductor, whereas it was, the other major choice in HH1, is a little weak in this edition, but it does have a really good situational cyber theurgy power, and you may already have an army theme to this as well. Myrmidax, likewise, is fairly weak in what it brings, but is situationally good for the extra line, and is quite heavily themed as well if you want to do that Myrmidon Destroyer Cult style army. Lacrimata is a very strong choice for Myrmidon or Thalax heavy armies. When you're buffing those units, it can buff, and I think probably the stronger choice than Myrmidax, in fact, for doing a Myrmidon themed army. Archimandrite allows you to have a second Mechanicum detachment in, a second Archmagos, as well as generally just bring more options on the table. And the stuff it does is quite generic and, can work with most things. Macrotech gives you an interesting option to use Tech Priest Auxilia as troops, which might factor into the way you'll build your army, which is kind of cool and definitely something you could build around. Doesn't give you much else in the way of great abilities on the table, though. And then finally, Malagra doesn't really offer you anything that other Arcana can't do better. It gives you the data spike weapons, which aren't very good. But if you're looking for an interesting, unusual kind of new theme, certainly something that you might choose to do. So what does this mean for list building then, or how do we bring all these things together into list building advice? Well, firstly, bring enough line. This is quite generic advice for Horus Heresy, but you do want to bring a good amount of line, and there are lots of options to do that, depending on what you've taken. So generally, you'll be looking at, for 2,000 points, you'll be looking at bringing maybe 3, but ideally 4 or 5 line, and maybe about 6 and 3,000 points, something like that. Focus on shooting, of course. This is a shooting army, and make sure you bring enough guns. You do have to be careful not to invest too much into support, because you have got lots of options in the army, the Tech Priests, the HQs. You've got the potential to spend lots of points on support units, which means that if your opponent just shoots all your guns off the table, your support units, which are quite expensive, may not have anything to do. And again, don't invest too heavily in kitting those support units out, because these Magi do have a lot of options and you can do a lot of cool stuff with them. But if they're just going to be casting a cyber theurgy power every turn, it might not be worth investing too many points into them. If you do want to melee, you need to commit to it. So if you're going to try to do some melee focused thing, or at least have a melee focused portion of your army, you need to make sure you're bringing blind, concussive, and you need to make sure you're really focusing on the best melee options in the army, which are basically Myrmidax, Archmagos, the Moirax, and Rad Grenades, or also Secutors as well. Those are the best options there are, and so if you're going to try it, at least bring the best ones. You've got to figure out how and when you're going to use Cyber Theurgy and Battlesmith. Now, this is quite important to do in list building because you need a specific reason for taking those support models. If you're going to take a Cybernetica, Artificer, Cybernetica, Magos, for example, you probably want a plan that says, I'm going to give my unit 1 extra ballistic skill and reactions every turn, and you know you're going to do that every turn. You can factor that into the way you build the army. Don't just take throw-in support units for no particular reason, because then you won't get the value out of them. You also need to figure out how you're going to use the Cyber Theurgy without pinning yourself, because you can pin yourself easily to a game loss with one bad Cyber Theurgy roll, because you pin yourself for your turn and the enemy turn, and also your next turn as well, because of the way the pinning rules work. So you might just, YOLO this and just hope you don't fail the roll, is one way of doing it. But, depending on taking your Abeyant, where you got the Monstrous to make you immune to pinning, or putting the units with robots so they become immune to pinning, you've got to have a plan for that so it doesn't just cause you terrible, random game losses. Playing to Mechanicum Strengths, the AP2 and 3 area weapons that they've got really help redress the balance against Legions. So whereas Legions are much more efficient, Legions aren't as good as Mechanicum are at just killing lots of Marines. So bringing those weapons really helps balance out the games. And, if your objective is to have more balanced games against enemies, those are one of the best ways to do that. Have a plan for killing enemy dreadnoughts and a plan for killing enemy vehicles. These are, generic list building advice really, but particularly for killing dreadnoughts, because Mechanicum don't have dreadnoughts of their own to go and, have dreadnought fights. We need a specific way to kill it. Luckily, we got access to lots of graviton weapons, which is a really good way to do that. There's also some slight, dodgy sideways, like, maybe getting a Radphage off and just killing it with more normal weapons. Vehicles is a bit easier for Mechanicum. Luckily, we can easily kill vehicles with lots of different things as well, but make sure you have got enough things in your army to deal with those. You do need a plan for enemy melee units as well, for sure. So whether that's debuffs on your own melee, particularly we're talking about enemy weapon skill 5, like elite melee units in this case. Debuffs plus your own melee is one way. Tying them up in combat or just delaying them is valid. If you're fighting against enemy assault squads, for example, that are only strength 4, chucking 3 Castellax into them is going to stop them going anywhere for quite a while. Also, chucking knights into some enemy units can do the same. So tying them up in combat is one way. And Overwatch and Hope is also another valid plan. Because, quite simply, Mechanicum don't have the greatest ways of dealing with enemy melee units, really. So just making sure that your units do have reactions enabled and that you can overwatch enemy melee units. Bearing in mind you've also got Gruiso Protocol from Knight Myrmidax as well, is potentially a way that you might deal with this too. And then finally, if you are building for flavour or a theme, please do make sure you bring enough good units that you still have a fun game. There's nothing worse than building your perfectly themed army with loads of cool units, but every game you play you just take your stuff off the board because your army's not very good. So, you've got to find that balance, build your flavour, build your theme, but also give yourself a good chance of having a good game too. Let's take a look at my 2 Mechanicum lists that I'm currently building, which puts all of this advice into action. So the first list is Cybernetica. Now, Cybernetica is certainly not the strongest list you could build, but it's a list that lots of people already own, and lots of us want to play a big bunch of stompy robots marching forward down the battlefield. So this is my attempt to make that as good as it can be within the tools we've been given. So I've got an Archmage's Prime on an Abeyant. He's got the Cybernetica High Techno-Arcana. He's got Artificer Cybernetica, which all of the Magos in this army have got, unsurprisingly. He's got the Logic of Victory Warlord trait, which gives me an extra reaction every phase and buffs my ballistic skill, movement, etc. when reacting with his unit, which is pretty good. He's on with a Photon Gauntlet in addition to his Power Axe, which gives me a nice little AP2 close range that can blind enemies. So the hope with this is that if his unit, the Castellax he's with, do get charged, or if they want to make a charge, he's got a chance of blinding the enemy first, in which case the Castellax suddenly will come out on top in combat. And he's also got an Augury Scanner, because it's cheap and you should always carry them, a Cyber Familiar to give him a 3+ invulnerable save, and he's got Rad Grenades as well, which means that all of those Castellax and himself in melee are going to be causing instant death with any of the hits that do get through against enemies, which does give me at least a scary potential for killing enemy units in melee, even if it's not the best. Now, the idea with this Archmageos on the Abeyant and the Dominus on the Abeyant, which you'll see I've also got Cyber Familiars, is that each one of them will generally join a Castellax unit, and they are pretty tanky. They've got 3+ invulnerable saves, and the Magos Dominus have also got a 5+ Feel No Pain. So these can take hits for the Castellax and make the Castellax last longer and be more survivable, whilst also bringing their Augury Scanners and also their Cybernetica powers to the unit as well. To give you some idea, the Dominus in particular are the best at this. 10 Space Marine las cannons with ballistic skill 4 shooting at that unit of Castellax. If you take all the hits on the Dominus between their 3+ invuln and their 5+ feel no pain, he will take 1 wound on average from that unit of 10 las cannons. Now that's a lot of firepower soaking, and that will hopefully let the Castellax stay around long enough to, attrition down some enemies and maybe balance out the general, sort of superior firepower of the Space Marines. Now, I would point out at this juncture that I hate wound allocation shenanigans. I think it shouldn't be in the game. I hate Artificer armor, all that kind of stuff. Totally not for me. But while it is in the game, and we've been dealt a reasonably mediocre book, these are the kind of things we can use to help balance out stuff a little bit. So 3 characters there, probably going with the 3 units of Castellax and bringing their buffs to them. These are going to be casting +1 ballistic skill and reactions every turn. If they fail, the unit doesn't get pinned because it's automata, so that's okay. Sometimes, depending on the situation, they might use reactions and they ignore the first wound on every shooting attack. So if you think you've got a unit that's going to get focused, that buff is really good because it takes a wound off every shooting attack that comes in for the turn. That's pretty good, but you still want to keep your reactions most of the time. So I've got 3 units of Castellax, 3x3, not too big so that they don't atomantic deflect or explode too much onto themselves when one of them dies. 2 with Darkfire Cannons and 1 with Multi-Melters. Now, the Multi-Melter one is mostly there for variation, to be honest with you. I think Darkfire Cannons and everything would probably be better, but it is a little bit more survivable because it doesn't get hot itself. It is a little bit better, gives you an option for close-up vehicle killing or, doing more frequent wounds to dreadnoughts, that kind of thing. So it does have a reason to be there. We got 1 Vorax in for a little bit of a wild card, a bit of a roamer. I would really like to have 3 Vorax in here to make the army a bit more maneuverable, and that might be somewhere I go with this in future if I decide to take something else out. And then we've got a Thanatar Kavas with the big plasma mortar to really take advantage of, its ability to punish enemy Space Marines and enemy elite Space Marines with 2+ saves as well. And then the Thanatar Calyx to bring that anti-tank to really be able to punish enemy vehicles, enemy dreadnoughts. And if it's not killing enemy dreadnoughts, at least it's shock pulsing them. So they're, poor at return and fire as well. So those 2 Thanatar combo there looks cool. 2 more robots in the Cybernetica army. Totally on theme. Not loads of stuff in this army, but that's what you expect from an army of robots. But I think it does the Cybernetica thing as well as you can expect it to be done. I'm also working on a Myrmidax army. Now, Myrmidax, as I mentioned before, I think is quite weak as a high Techno-Arcana, but that's what we're using, so we're going to try to play to its strengths. Archmagus Prime on foot, he's got Hatred, he's got 5 wounds from Myrmidax. He's got Stoic Defender, so that I get an extra shooting phase reaction, because most of my army can react already, and it means that his unit can pin. He's got Ephemera and Cursus, so he's going to use that to target enemy units, give them -2 leadership, potentially blind them. He's going to be with a unit with Graviton guns, so that's -2 leadership for the concussion check they're probably going to take as well. He's got a Photon Gauntlet because, again, it's just a cheap, efficient weapon. But if I decide not to use Ephemera and Cursus's power because I don't want to get pinned, so I have no defense against failing that check in this army, I'm just going to hope he doesn't roll over a 10. And sometimes that's all you can hope for. At least he's still got the Photon Gauntlet to force blind checks. He's got a Machinator Array to make him better. Also gives him a Melter Gun and a Flamer, which is good. And he's got a Cyber Familiar and Rad Grenades as well. So he's pretty good in combat. He's as good as it gets in combat. And he's going to join a unit of Secutors, and they're going to try and melee things with all his buffs and debuffs. Concussive, Blind, Pinning, Rad Grenades to try and make them good in combat. I've got a Magus Dominus that I've kept quite cheap, so he's going to hang out just to make sure the Thanatar Kavas and the Calyx in the list have both got a Cortex controller, and also to buff them a bit with Artificer Cybernetica as well, possibly also give one of them some reactions or night vision ignoring from his cheap little augury scanner. And then I've got the Myrmidax Special Thanatar Calyx in a HQ slot as well, so he makes nearby Myrmidons line. The problem with that Myrmidax ability, and one of the reasons I say Myrmidax is quite weak, is if the Calyx dies, I've got no line. It would have been nice if it just made Myrmidons line, I think. To compensate for that, I've got some other line troops in my army just in case. So I've got 3 Thalax because I think they look quite cool with a Plasma Fusil, and I've got 10 Thralls, so just, one of each, which is fine. Gives me some variation to the army. I've also got the main meat of the army. I've got 4 Secutors with Grav Guns, so this is where the Prime is going to join generally, and they're all going to jump in a Triaros. So turn 1, they're going to drive down the board, jump out and shoot something. And then either, if the enemy charges them, they're pretty good in combat. And if not, I'm going to go and charge something next turn. Then I've got another unit of 3 Secutors with grav guns and 3 with phased plasma fusils. These are going to walk up the battlefield with the Thanatar Calyx be in line, probably holding some objectives. I've got a unit of Tech Priest Auxilia. They're Engine Seer. The main reason I've brought these is the Nuncio Vox. This army throws out a crazy number of templates, and this is the way to get rerolls on all of them. And particularly what I'm trying to guard against here is my close range units firing graviton templates at things and then having them bounce back in their way when they want to charge, because Secutors are pretty decent in combat compared to most Marine units as well. Secondarily, these Auxilia are Engine Seers, so they can heal stuff. So mostly I'm thinking about the Cavas. As it damages itself with a Plasma Mortar, these are going to be repairing it a little bit. Then I've got 3 Myrmidon Destructors, still playing into the theme, but bringing the really powerful Irradiation Engines, which are just great at taking units of Marines off the table. Again, helping me balance out my somewhat weak, less powerful than Marine list by, giving me the ability to take some Marines off and using a super powerful weapon. And then I've got a Thanatar Cavas to do exactly the same thing too. So some great Marine killing power. I think this Cavas could also be a Karachnos if you wanted to do something different. I own a painted Cavas, so I'm obviously going to use it. But this could be really anything that is good at killing Marines in that last heavy support slot as well. So there you go, there's my 2 armies, and I think both of them are pretty good. They're both themed, and the main driver for both of them is the theme that I'm playing to, but I've tried to make them as good as they can be on the table while sticking to the theme and being interesting forces to collect and paint as well. So in summary, everything we've talked about and what we've learned, Liber Mechanicum is generally a bit weaker than the Legion Libers. Again, I just want to be clear about this. I'm not suggesting they're not. I think anyone reading it can tell that they are. They're quite a complex army to build and play. There's lots of synergies that you have to use to get the value out of them. They've got a lot of weaknesses to play around because they're a very focused army, focused on the shooting. Lots of things that you got to plan for, like failed cyber theurgy rolls being quite a big deal. And there's less raw stats in the Legion units. But that does make the army actually very fun and interesting army to play, and certainly a challenge if you're a more experienced player to try and make these work, or if you just want the challenge of that because you think it's fun. There's a lot of decisions to get the most out of this army. That's one of the things that excites me about it, as well as the models. You can compensate for the weaknesses in the army, though, by playing to some of the stronger parts. So the ability to just take lots of Marines off the table is certainly maybe not the most fun thing in the world in a lot of ways, and it's actually good that this was gone from the Legion Liber books, but Mechanicum have still got it, and if you want to play to the book strengths, that's a thing you can use to bring a bit of balance back there. If you do have a heavy theme in mind, which means that you do use some of the more subpar units in the books, you just increase the density of those powerful units too, and make sure that your games are not blowouts. And in doing that, it means that you and your opponent can have good games. You can enjoy playing your Mechanicum book without worrying too much that the book was maybe not as good as it could have been. And that's the end of the show. I really hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please like and subscribe to the channel, and please do leave me a comment down below. And don't forget to join the Heresy community on Discord. The link to that's in the video description. See you all soon, everybody. Bye-bye.